All right, guys, check this out. Today, I want to talk about some of the specifications I've kind of been uncovering on the new 2025 Ram 1500 RHO. You might ask, why am I interested in this? I'm interested because it's a really cool truck that's going to be a really high value off-road truck. And you'd say, maybe, well, I think it's a huge downside versus the TRX. I won't disagree in some ways. The TRX is awesome, had the 6.2 supercharged V8, phenomenal. Unfortunately, that engine's gone. But the alternative has some unique things to it. From the pricing standpoint, I think it's going to be incredible value off-road truck. And that's what I want to talk about today. Also want to look into the fuel economy again and kind of come up with some assumptions what this could possibly be. Let's do this. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about, the rear axle. There's been a lot of questions on, does it still get the Dana 60 axle that's been in the back of the TRX? Is it something different? The reason I've been kind of confused about it is when I saw the literature on the RHO, it said the rear axle was a 250 millimeter rear axle. But what's odd is the Dana 60 is a 256. So I actually went and found some photos online, and I'm going to show you right here. This is a picture that was just released recently, and this is the RHO rear axle assembly. And if we look at the gusseting that goes through, count how many bolts there are around the differential cover, look at the stamping, look at the weld gussets, nuggets, how it all attaches. Now let's look at the TRX. So here is the TRX rear axle. Gusseting's the same, stamping's the same, weld areas are the same, differential cover. This is telling me this is the exact same Dana 60 rear axle. We know the internals are different because the TRX ran 355 gears and the RHO is actually going to have 392 gears, but externally they both look like they're going to be standard Dana 60 rear axles. What's going to be interesting is there any other changes internally on the rear axle that's going to change. Next thing I want to talk about is this transmission. So the TRX had an 8 HP 95 transmission, the same one that the Trackhawk got. It's beefed up to take the power of the supercharged 6.2 liter. But the 8 HP 75 is still a really great trans. I've had a bunch of these transmissions behind Eco Diesels and Hemis. I've never had a problem with this. In fact, I like this better than a Ford 10-speed transmission. It seems to shift a little smoother and it just feels a little less clunky. So what I'm really curious about when I started looking at this data sheet is looking at these specs and kind of looking at the different drive ratios. If I look on this one over here, on this different transmission schematic, you can see drive ratios 1st through 8th with the final drive ratio also for reverse. And you can see it's a 4.7 to 1. But then there's also another version over here of a 5 to 1. And you can kind of see the different overall, and you see the step ratios, everything. I'm sharing this because I haven't been able to figure out yet which drive ratios or ratios it's going to be for each gear, because I've heard some things that potentially this is going to have a little bit different gearing than the TRX trans, which is right here. So if we look at this gearing, this is overall very similar to this one. I mean, almost exactly the same ratio transmission. So there's a chance the 8 HP 75 and the 8 HP 95 from TRX to RHO is in fact the exact same transmission ratio. We don't know quite yet, but I did at least want to kind of share this so you can kind of look into this. And in general, you can kind of see just some of the different specs as far as capacity, turbine capacities. You can kind of see the mass of the transmission and some of the things like this. In general, ZF has a phenomenal track record for building quality automotive transmissions throughout the industry. BMWs, Audis, Chrysler, Ram products. I mean, they're kind of the benchmark, and Ford and GM actually had to come up with ways to benchmark this transmission to make their 10-speed trans. And I would argue to this day, I think this is probably a better transmission than the 10-speed that's been with Ford. I mean, they're still struggling with some issues there. It's great trans until you have an issue with the CDF drum or valve bodies or clunkiness. And then back to just the standard transmission ratio. And you can kind of see the other thing I'm trying to find out is if this is actually going to get the TRX transfer case. I think it actually is, because it's got the auto transfer case and not a too high only option. So I don't think you're going to get the one from the standard Grand Cherokee. My guess it is going to be the TRX version. Now, here's another thing that's really interesting about the powertrain. on the Hurricane engine versus, say, the Ford 3.5 liter high output EcoBoost. Ram with the Hurricane engine is running an air to water intercooler, where Ford is running an air to air. There's some really interesting things here. Air to water, if done correctly, can withdraw more heat from the compressor than a air to air intercooler. Also, one of the other advantages from an air to water intercooler system versus an air to air intercooler system is less lag in the turbos. There's a potential this thing will build boost quicker and faster and have less lag than the air to air you would get on the 3.5 EcoBoost. What'll be interesting to see though is, how do these things both work when they're heat soaked? I've noticed with the 3.5 high output EcoBoost, once your air intake temps start getting above 130 degrees, you get massive timing changes and the power drops pretty substantially. So if you're in the dunes or pushing it off road or you're towing, once you start getting some heat into that intake, you can feel a pretty substantial power drop. So this could be an area where, if Ram has done it and sized the system accordingly, this thing could be a beast with the cooling and the intercooler system. Also, some other things. People had questions about what's the difference in the Hurricane high output 540 motor versus a standard output. Well, we both know they're running forged crank and forged connecting rods, but there's a big difference in the pistons. The standard output uses cast aluminum pistons, whereas the high output is actually using a forged piston. So we know it's got forged pistons. We know it's got bigger turbos. It's running 26 pounds of boost, which is massive compared to Ford's 3.5 liter EcoBoost. That's considerably higher. We also know it's got a little bit different compression ratio. So I'm going to be wondering, with fully forged internals, is this motor capable of a lot more than what Chrysler is going to be offering? And then lastly, you kind of talk about the pounds. This is 150 pounds lighter than a TRX. So as I mentioned in prior videos, where things get interesting to me, specifically on RHO, is the numbers Ram is throwing out. They say 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. When Ram released the TRX, it was 0 to 60 in 4.5. Yet a bunch of people found that realistically it was good for like 4.0. So if Ram has some tricks up their sleeve, I wonder if this thing's actually going to be more like a 4.1. If that's the case, this thing's going to be a really strong runner, and it's going to be incredible, because I think it's going to really have to keep Ford on its feet, and they're going to have to either increase power or come up with some ways to compete, maybe some hybrid stuff. But lastly, everybody's wondering, okay, we see the pricing, we see the performance, we know the shocks, trans, horsepower. Where is this thing going to fall for fuel economy? And I'm going to tell you my thought and logic before the EPA releases the numbers. We're probably not going to see this for every bit of 4+ months now, but I just selected a few different trucks here so we can kind of look at this. If we look at the high output version of a standard 2025 Ram with the Hurricane today, you see 15 city, 21 highway, 17 combined. Now let's compare that to the standard output. Same truck, just from going from standard to high, you lose 3 miles per gallon on the highway, 2 in the city, with an overall combined drops 2 miles per gallon. What's wild is, check out the difference in fuel cost over 5 years. You only lose 2 miles per gallon, but it's an extra almost $6,000. But now let's add 2 more variables to this. Let's look at what the TRX was rated at for 2024. 10 city, 14 highway. Now, let's look at where the base Raptor is at. 14 city, 18 highway. It's literally only 1 mile per gallon less than the Ram high output, 3 mile per gallon less highway, but an overall combined 1 mile per gallon less. So the question is, where's this thing going to fall? We know it's not going to be as good as the standard high output, and we know it's going to be better than a TRX. If I had to put a guess on this thing, I'm thinking this is going to be about 13 miles per gallon city, maybe 16 highway, with a combined of about 13 to maybe 14. I don't think it'll do as good as the F-150 Raptor, because the Raptor is about 600 to 700 pounds lighter weight. And just generally speaking, I found that the Ford seems to always get a little bit better fuel economy than the Ram. If we look at an F-150 3.5 today versus a Ram standard output on the same fuel economy loop, I find they get about 3 to 4 miles per gallon better. So I'm going to guess right now and say it's going to fall somewhere in that range of a 13 mile per gallon city and maybe a 15 highway. And just for a little more perspective, I just added the Ram TRX versus standard Raptor versus HO, and you can kind of see the delineation. TRX versus Raptor R, both rated at 12 highway. City's very similar with only a 1 mile per gallon improvement, but you can kind of see the difference between V6 and Raptor R. You can see it's a pretty big hit for fuel economy, but then when we go back to the standard 3.5, this is where my theory comes. You lose 6 miles per gallon with the 3.5 going to the Raptor on the highway and 2 mile per gallon on the city. So if we see that same thing, I think the logic would be an RHO is going to probably fall in that 13 mile per gallon city, maybe, and maybe 15, 16 on the highway. So anyhow, I hope you find this video helpful. There's still a lot of speculation on this, but a surprise, I might be placing an order for an RHO because this truck highly interests me for the price you can get one of these things. I'm curious your thoughts. Leave some comments down below. Do you think this is going to be the best value full-size off-roading truck for 2024? Thanks for watching.